Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Bott. I'm the Head of Innovation at the SCI, and it's my privilege to chair this afternoon's meeting. We're going to do something different. Usually we have scientific talks or application talks or something, but as with the last meeting, we're exploring the relationship between the chemical industry, the chemistry that's all around us, and how it's perceived by the general public. And an incredibly important route for that is through the media. So we have a talk by a really important speaker, and I'll come to him in a minute, but for the organizational thing, I'm the chairperson. Paul is the Q&A moderator, and I'm going to talk about him in a minute. And the two people in the middle, the top one is Sarah Skerritt, who's the head of chemistry for the UK in MSD. And the bottom one is Kevin Matthews, who's the CEO of Scott Bader. And they are both really, really involved in the reputation of chemistry, its importance. And they're going to add to the mix by asking and debating some particular questions with our speaker after he's given his main speech. So after that, there will be a more general Q&A session, which Paul is moderating. So if you look into the bottom of your screen, you'll find the questions box. If you can put a question in at any point, and it will be recorded, and we will try and assemble them if there are similar things, but basically it's there. You're in listen mode only, so you won't be able to be spoken or things like that. So that's just housekeeping. Our speaker this evening is actually a really very, very good science correspondent. When I first met him, he was in The Guardian many, many years ago. He's been at the ITN, and now he's at The Economist. He's also written books. He is a really very involved journalist. He goes and looks at things. He's been to places where things are happening and such, and he's also a really nice bloke, to be honest. But you should all go and read his books. So if I could hand over to him to give the introduction to set the scene, as it were, and then in about 20 or 25 minutes, we'll get into the discussion about some specific issues with Sarah and Kevin. So Alok, please, can you take the floor?
Hello, thanks for that introduction, David. I'm going to share my screen, so let me do that quickly. So it's nice to be here. I'm Alok. I'm a science correspondent at The Economist, as David said. I have been doing science journalism for 20 years now, which seems ridiculous given how young I look. The reason I did all of it in the first place is I'm a physicist by background. That was my original science. The last time I did chemistry in any sort of official way was my A-levels. I did get an A, so it's something. Now, I love science. I think it's really interesting. That's partly why I'm interested in writing about it. And so in the years that I've been doing this job in various different formats, I've learned a lot of things. I think I'll share them with you tonight. And then you can ask specifically about chemistry and the chemical industries as springs off from these sorts of things I've learned. And the reason my talk's called Good and Bad Science Communication is just because it's that. It's basically what's good and what's bad in the things that I've learned over the years. Now, there's a subtitle to this, which is how to avoid boring people, because fundamentally when you're storytelling and you want people to be interested in something that they're not paid to be interested in, which is all of my readers, then you have to make it interesting. You have to tell a story. You have to do it in a way that is relevant to them. In other words, you can't bore people with this stuff. So how do you make it all interesting? How do you present stories? And fundamentally, I could have titled the talk this, how to tell a story. Okay, so let's step back a bit and look at what science is. So, what is science? I mean, normally, if I was to do this talk in person, I'd ask you to tell me what you think science is. But since I can't see or hear any of you, I'm going to imagine you sort of shouting out answers and things. So what is science? Well, science is objective and detached. Well, at least it's supposed to be in the sort of purest form. You're meant to be finding out the truth about the world, or some understanding of the world. It's full of shades of grey, right? Basically, one of the things you learn as a scientist as you're trained is that you don't discover new facts. It's just you reduce the uncertainty of what you know and what you don't know. as you discover more evidence. It's full of likelihoods and probabilities, it's possibilities, there's lots of statistics involved to really get to what's going on, sometimes in very complicated systems. There's no such thing as certainty, which is kind of like a summation of all of the points above. What is storytelling? Now, this is what I said to you at the beginning, if you want to make people interested in something, whatever the topic, you have to tell them a story. So we've just defined what science is. So what is storytelling? Storytelling is usually always personal and subjective. If you tell somebody about something that happened to you and you tell it as a story, it's about you. It's about something that's going on in your world, and you want people to be interested. People are interested in other people for the large part. So stories are about people and the things that people do. It's full of anecdotes. Oh, this happened to me yesterday. Did you hear about this? That kind of thing. It's full of sort of fragments of information. It's simple and unnuanced. You kind of have to explain things really quickly to get to the different elements of your story. If you think about a Hollywood film, great bit of storytelling, or a great novel, or a comic, storytelling, they want you to know what happens. They want you to keep in mind what's going on, so that then whatever happens next becomes an interesting part of that story, and you sort of follow that story, and it's got to be relatively clear and straightforward. What else? Next. There's often judgments of what's right and wrong. There's a bad guy and there's a good guy, and there's often people who are going on some sort of journey to sort of improve themselves or become evil or whatever it is. There's some sort of evolution in that thing that you can work out that someone is quite clear in their thinking. So that, again, it goes back to the simple, unnuanced thing, which is that you don't want something that's too complicated. So you're thinking about that whilst the story moves along, and then you're confused. Now, I'm going to go through some examples of bad science communication as things that, we kind of keep in mind as journalists and many scientists too. You've probably all heard about the MMR and autism issue from many decades ago now, almost 20 years ago now. This happened where a doctor published in a respected medical journal that MMR, the triple jab vaccination, in some way caused autism. There's a series of case studies, essentially. Admittedly, the media were too credulous at the time, didn't really ask the sorts of questions that might be necessary. Neither the media nor scientists in that came out well, because there was all sorts of issues with how that was communicated. And many decades later, we're still living with the issues of vaccine hesitancy and anti-vax sentiment. These things have real world consequences. Another one was genetically modified crops. Again, I can't see you in the audience, so I don't know how many of you may remember this from in the late 1990s when GM crops became a technology to try and test out. The UK wanted to introduce them to the country, for obviously good reasons in terms of, the fact that GM crops might be able to feed more people or grow in particular climates that you couldn't grow crops in, or whatever else. Many environmental groups didn't like the idea at all of GM crops, and got hold of various correspondents in the media and just told them all about things like Franken foods, Frankenstein foods, essentially. And it was actually really concerning, because what it showed is that when you have bad information out there, it's not good enough just to sort of keep quiet and not challenge it, because you feel like, oh, that's giving it too much attention, or it gives it too much credence. Because what happened in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, when GM crops were being introduced, and science correspondents, not me, this is the stories from my colleagues older than me, they would ring up agricultural scientists, molecular biologists, they ring them up and say, look, can you help us explain to our readers that these GM crops are not as bad as everyone's going on about? And actually, we need to do these experiments to understand what the capabilities and good and bad points are. Many of the scientists at the time, and it feels odd saying this now because the scientists are not like this anymore, the scientists at the time would say things like, no, I'm not going to speak about it because it would give credence to crazy ideas. And also, if the members of the public really wanted to know about GM crops, they can just go and read the scientific journals themselves. I mean, I think you'll all agree that hardly anyone reads scientific journals, not even the scientists themselves. So never mind the public, never mind also the questions of actual access to the scientific journals in the first place, or being able to understand them, of course. Okay, and then for me, a personal hatred of bad science communication is any words with breakthroughs or cures that are just around the corner. But that's just something personal. I just think that it's tired and overused. Okay, let's look at some positive things now. Good science communication. The Large Hadron Collider. I'm fairly sure that this audience, all of you know what the Large Hadron Collider is. But how many of you actually understand what the Higgs boson is? And again, I can't see you, but I'm assuming that some of you do, but most of you probably don't. Now, in July 2012, when the Higgs boson was discovered, the seminar that they had to actually announce the discovery of this fundamental piece of physics, this arcane piece of physics, was so popular that actually it almost broke the internet. There were so many people trying to access it that the CERN server fell apart. The Large Hadron Collider had spent a decade, and the scientists and journalists and things had spent a decade explaining this experiment in almost excruciating detail, talking about fundamental physics in very, very detail, in films, in books, in articles, every interview they could give to build up to this moment. And when that moment arrived, everyone, the whole world stopped for like half a day to actually understand very complicated things. Now, one thing I like to remind people is, I'm not sure who gets this joke, but the Large Hadron Collider, that's Comic Sans. This is the font that was used by Fabiola Gianotti, who's now the Director General of CERN, but was then, back then, was one of the lead scientists of one of the big experiments there. She presented the Higgs boson to the world using Comic Sans, and there's her presentation. And this was the initial sort of slide from that. Now, what does any of this mean? What is all of that stuff? And the point is that this is not meant to be meaningful to the public. This is meant to be meaningful to other physicists, but half the world was watching this amazing physics seminar, which I'm sure none of them understood, but they were really keen to understand what happened next, because the story had been set up for so long that this thing was happening. It meant this. It was so emotionally important to all these other people, and that the world should want this. And here we are. We're about to get a result. It's like the final third act of a movie. It's like, did the hero win or not? So the Large Hadron Collider is a great example. Another example I love is European Space Agency's Rosetta mission. This was the one that went off to chase a comet and then land Philae, which is the little lander on the comet. And this is a picture of the experiment. There's Philae, it's just sort of popping off the main body of Rosetta, and it landed on a comet called 67P, which is underneath. Now, it was one of the most amazing missions ever. I mean, engineering-wise, it was fascinating. It really makes you sing and be proud of how humans can do amazing things. They chased this comet at an incredible speed for 10 years. They got to it, they landed on it. And then, we spent 3 days. I was working at ITN at the time on TV news, and we led all of the ITV news bulletins on this project for 3 days, like 3 times a day. It was unbelievable. I was gobsmacked. I thought we'd go there for 1 day and report whether it landed or not, and then come home again. But no, we were in mission control in Darmstadt for 3 days. And I'm not just me, people all over the world, NBC, ABC, all over the, newspapers and magazines and TV channels from all over the world were fixated on every bit of the orbital mechanics of how this was working, and whether Philae would be able to send back its data in time, because if you remember, it landed at a funny angle and it couldn't recharge its batteries, so it only lasted 3 days. And this didn't come from nowhere. This came from many, many years of preparing people for this mission, explaining what it was all about, doing things like this. There's this fantastic cartoon comic thing, which the European Space Agency's European Space Agency's communications department, which is pretty good. They created essentially characters for these things. I'm not, by the way, suggesting that everyone has to do this all the time, but this was just a very good example, and then they had comics for kids and explainers for adults, and it gave people a sense of why this mattered really early on, so that when the things were going on in space, many, many millions of miles away, they were invested. The European Space Agency's comms team also set up Twitter feeds for the lander and Rosetta, including this tweet, which went out late on Friday night, just as Philae's batteries were running out, and it sent all its data. And there was a real, end of Terminator 2 sort of vibe to the fact that this robot millions of miles away was dying, but had done something great for humanity. Philae sort of sent this message to Rosetta saying, it's feeling tired and everything. And I remember, this sounds ridiculous, but we spent 3 days talking about solar system physics, orbital dynamics. We talked about what the experiments that were going to be running up there, what they were going to look for, why it mattered. I mean, it's some deep stuff that we got onto the news for 3 or 4 days. And then in the end, obviously Philae, the running out of the batteries, and everyone on Twitter went crazy for this thing, was sending it good wishes and things. It sounds a bit silly, but you know what? There was a lot of science that was discussed, and a lot of science that people still care about from this mission in the public. You talk to any news editor about Rosetta or Philae, and they'll put the story on the or in the newspaper or on the news immediately. They know what it is. They don't have to have it explained to them or why it's important. And the last bit, here's some more of the Twitter feed. The conversation between the Rosetta and Philae is quite sweet. The last example I'm going to give you is human-animal hybrids. This is back in 2009, back when stem cell research was still relatively new, and scientists wanted a source of stem cells that didn't involve destroying human embryos. And so one technique they came up with was to take the embryos of rabbits and other animals, take out the nucleus, put a human egg nucleus in it, and then reproduce that to create the stem cells. Hybrid animals, hybrid embryos they were called. And to do that, though, the law needed to change in the UK. Parliament needed to vote on this, and scientists made a very strong case for it. But having learned the lessons of the GM crops debacle a decade earlier, like they really learned the lessons, there was a very sort of careful education campaign that also accompanied this whole desire to try and get the law changed, which involved dozens of stem cell scientists talking in the news all the time, explaining the purpose of this work, asking members of the public to ask them questions. There was a lot of pushback from religious groups and others saying that we shouldn't be doing this sort of work. MPs, of course, were lobbied. Every single MP that wanted a sit-down conversation with a scientist was given one. There were all sorts of very careful, very patient attempts for scientists to get to where people were on this issue and try and persuade them gently without sort of saying, oh, just listen to us, we know better than you. In the end, the law was changed, and in Parliament, it was voted through unanimously, which just shows that if you take your case to the press, the public, and be on their side and help them understand and not bark orders, then scientists can influence the course of national debates and lead them as well. There can be a real great value in speaking up, not least because also the science that people are doing is just interesting, and there's lots of fascinating things to talk about in the science itself, that kind of can turn people's attentions away from some of the more depressing things in the news. So let me just try and cull from those what I think good science communication is. What are the sort of tips? Communicating science is not easy at all. Don't get me wrong. It's not that everyone should be able to do it straight out of the bat. If you're focused on one tiny thing in your career, one tiny aspect of a subject, it can be very difficult to zoom out and see the bigger picture, because you've got to remember you're talking to people who don't have your many, many, many years of hard-won insight. You spent years looking at something, doing PhDs and being a professor and all of those things. If you start talking to somebody who literally isn't left chemistry before their GCSEs even, then they're not going to understand what you're saying. And so just remember that. And if you remember that, then you'll become more empathetic. You might become a bit more amenable to explaining things and letting them lead the conversation in some way. You have to remember what it's like not to know something. So the first thing you can do is to be authentic, of course. If you're an expert in something, you are the expert, and so you have authority, and people like that. You can be upfront about things you don't understand. You can be upfront about your weaknesses and the weaknesses of your research. All of that builds trust, and it builds credibility. that you're going to tell people the truth and that you're on their side on things. You've got to when you're doing a bit of science communication, I think the thing is always to identify what your purpose is. Is your purpose to spread your work as widely as possible? Is it to explain your work to peers? You've got to understand the difference between these two different things, or three or four, whatever things you want to do. Understand the differences between them. This is basically another way of saying identify your audience, which is the most important thing journalists think about all the time. Who's my audience? Who's reading this? It will change the language you use. It will change the kinds of explanations you use. It's really, really important. So tell a story. This is what I've been sort of trying to get at from the beginning. Science is one of the great mystery stories because it drips with all sorts of human drama. And there's always a room for sequels in this story because, you know, it's never finished. The topic is never finished. Now, scientists, when you're doing science, you're trained to keep emotion or subjectivity out of it. That's the point, and that's a good thing. But often, some of the most interesting science stories are about the people doing the discovery. So, if you want to tell a story, remember, it's good to keep the way a story works in mind. You know, what is this basic narrative arc? It's step one, this is how the world was. Step two, this is what we discovered, or this is what we did. Step three, and since then, this has been the new view of the world. That's a basic story. Now, edit. This is when you've written something or you've produced something, you've got to edit. You leave out the bits that no one reads, as one of my editors once said. You shouldn't be including huge, dense paragraphs of description and background that don't really move your story forward. Just because you have spent loads of time researching something doesn't mean that everyone wants to read all of that. Now, this applies to me too. You know, I spend ages researching a story, and often because I'm so carefully into it, I want people to know just how much research I've done. So that means basically putting lots of words and paragraphs and references and things in there, which just show to my editor that I've done loads of work. But actually, he or she will usually just cut all that stuff out. Well, actually, I'll do it myself because I edit myself as well. But, you know, just leave out all those bits because, you know, it just gets in the way of understanding something. If people if you've got someone's attention for a few minutes, then the last thing you want to do is for them to turn off as you list a whole load of things that, you know, don't really tell you anything about what's the main point of your story is. Once you've edited, just edit some more. I mean, writing and communication and producing these things, it's all about editing. You've got your material, you just got to write, rewrite. You know, writing is basically just editing. Don't use jargon. You know, this may be obvious, but you might not know that you're using jargon. If you've been, you know, in an industry for a long time, certain words and phrases just pop out of your mouth, and it's good to check yourself with that stuff because it will alienate people really quickly if they don't understand something you're saying. And if you do use jargon, explain it quickly. If you have to use it, just explain what it means so that when you next use it, people know what you mean. Okay, and don't dumb things down. What I mean is that none of this, what I've just said, means that you have to turn it into some childlike story which you know doesn't get the essence of what you're actually trying to explain, and gets things wrong. You know, just assume that your audience is intelligent. At least that's what I do. I assume they're intelligent, but not yet informed about the topic I'm writing about. So you can use analogies and anecdotes and all sorts of things. You know, just, you know, don't. My editor again, the one I keep mentioning here, he said to me a long time ago, don't underestimate your reader's intelligence, but don't overestimate their knowledge, and that will stand you in good stead. Don't assume interest. Just because you've done something or you feel obliged to do loads of research or set up a company or whatever it is, don't assume that anyone feels obliged to listen to, you know, to the things you've written about or the company you've made. You have to earn attention. You have to earn people's time. They're busy. They've got lots of things to do. And so the way you earn time and attention is to think very carefully about the messages you want to communicate, and then craft them in such a way that the people you're talking to want to know more. So, you know, people hardly ever make decisions, whether it's about attention or anything else, on just being presented with good science. The message you have has to have meaning for them. It has to be useful. It has to acknowledge their needs and aspirations and concerns. I mean, that's how understanding your audience is a really important thing to do in the first place, and then how you can use that in the way you're communicating. And don't include everything. It's kind of a repeat of something earlier, but yeah, editing, it's kind of like an extension of editing. You might have spent 15 or 20 years getting to the point where you've made a particular discovery, or your company's done something amazing to this point. And you want people to get a sense of that, don't you, if you're telling the story of it. But you can't possibly spend 15 years telling people stories, because that's the only way they're going to get a sense of it, is to really have lived it with you. So you've got to cut things out. You've got to take things out. And I think that this is obvious when you say it, but it's very hard to do. So just be aware of that. And don't insult your reader, meaning, you, me, all of us in this audience, others who've had science training, we've been benefited from something wonderful, and it's been interesting, and it's a great way to think about the world. But not everyone is trained like this. Not everyone is trained in a scientific way of thinking, and there's nothing turns someone off than feeling like you think that they're stupid. And of course, I'm sure you don't think that when you're talking to people, but if that's the impression they get, because you're frustrated with the fact they don't understand Bayesian statistics, or they don't know what cosmology is, or whatever else, then that'll come through. And I think you've got to be a little bit careful of that sort of thing. Don't insult people. Just let me repeat my other sentence: never overestimate knowledge, but don't underestimate their intelligence. Okay, and the last thing I was going to say is you've got to enjoy it. If the communication you're doing is not enjoyable and not fun in some way, and I don't mean you've got to be doing cartwheels while you're doing it, but just it's got to be like, it evokes some emotion and remembrance of why you did all of this work in the first place, which must have been at some point because you're interested in something, and something sensational and fascinating. That's the feeling you want to invoke in other people. I think if you can do that, if you're doing that, if you're enjoying something in terms of the communication yourself, then that means that you might be engendering that in other people as well. And that's a good sign that what you're doing is a good job. And that's my presentation. So I'm happy to take questions from the panel at this point. Let me unshare my screen.
Thank you, Alok. Wonderful. You were getting a bit Maya Angelou towards the end there. I was impressed by that.
Sure, lovely.
So if Sarah and Kevin would like to turn on their screens and microphones, and as we discussed, I mean, the idea is to explore a couple of issues, areas with these two who live them on a daily basis. They're both very committed and very knowledgeable and very having fun. So Kevin, do you want to go with your sort of issue stroke question first?
Yeah, I will actually, and I'll pick up Alok, on something you said right at the start around storytelling, and that good stories have potentially a bad guy and a good guy, and I guess one of the challenges that I think the chemicals and the chemical industry has is it tends to be associated with being the bad guy, because chemicals, accidents, incidents, pollution, those are the things which people immediately sort of think about. And then the applications of chemicals, whether that's electric vehicles, batteries, wind turbines, drugs, they're the good guys, but they don't have chemical or chemistry anywhere in their title. And I guess for me, it's a question of how do we reposition that so we get a much better connection between the chemical industry and chemicals, and actually the benefits that those create to society through their applications.
Thanks, Kevin. And I think I totally hear what you're saying. And just to clarify, my good guys and bad guys thing was just an example, and not every story has to have it, but it was just an example of saying about keeping stories simple and quite easily understandable. Sometimes that means having a good guy and a bad guy. That's sometimes makes stories very clear as to motivations and things. But I totally hear what you're saying about chemistry and chemical being sometimes the bad guy in the world in terms of things like pollution, and is it going to be something artificial and all of that. I remember one of the places I worked, I won't name them, one of the places I worked a long time ago decided to do a series of supplements, I guess they were like 50-page booklets with all sorts of research and reporting and stuff in them, and they were called it's almost embarrassing, they were called Chemical World, and the point was to sort of point out where chemistry is. And the idea had been cooked up by, I wasn't quite, to be honest, till this day I'm not quite sure whether it was a good or a bad thing, but the idea was cooked up by people who clearly didn't understand science very well, because the title sounded quite nice, and they wanted to indicate the fact of the presence of chemistry in your world. Now, if you're any sort of sensible person, you know that a chemical is any molecule that you interact with on any moment. That's a chemical, right? This was a surprise to many people in that organization. They didn't know that. Now, could you say these are not stupid people? They were very, very intelligent. All of them have been to university in some guys. And so there's an education problem here, right? And then you have things of the environmental movements of the 60s and 70s and 80s talking about chemical pollution, and those consciousnesses being raised of chemicals being a pollutant and a bad thing, and effluent flowing into rivers and stuff. That's the narrative, right? And if you're thinking about environmentalism, that sort of hippie-ish environmentalism, there's a very anti-chemistry, not chemistry, but anti-chemicals vibe going on, and I think that's where it's all come from, hasn't it? Yeah. Modern environmentalism is a bit different, but this is the baggage, I think, that chemistry and chemicals.
Yeah, because we've inherited the narrative. That's the issue. Whereas the examples you gave where that narrative was effectively delivered, those sort of organizations had created the narrative.
Correct.
That resulted in the end point. Whereas here we actually inherit this narrative. So how do we change it?
So partly you have to understand why that narrative was created, why that narrative is there, right? Which is that a lot of the times in the last half of the last century, scientists who were doing good work in whatever industry just didn't bother telling anyone about it, because they felt, why should they? They go, why waste your time? And what that does is it leads to a vacuum, which sucks in all sorts of other weirdness, and people are scared of science and who don't understand science. And they were getting funded by the government, so they didn't care anyway. And the white heat of technology in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was all about that, wasn't it? And how the government wanted, the UK government and others wanted science to be the savior of humanity after the atom bomb. Basically, the scientists created the atom bomb, and scared the shit out of the world, excuse my language. And then they wanted scientists to sort of solve the problems by being this amazing force of good, right? And they funded them, set up things like research councils, and university academic culture was really started around then as well. And then what happened was that the ivory tower was built, and scientists thought, we're never going to leave this. This is us forever. And they didn't notice the rest of the world thought, hang on, who are these people and why are they doing it? And when all sorts of speculation sort of circulates about this stuff, then it means that no one was there to defend it, which is where we got to the GM crops debacle, which is in a way is also a chemistry problem, isn't it? So that's why the reason I say all of that is because it's worth looking at those things before you think how you might change them. Now, think about how GM crops or hybrid animal embryos and things, how they change their sort of narrative. One of the ways that, for example, GM crops, I mean, it's still controversial, but it's not as controversial as it was 20 years ago. One of the ways that that's done it is to really talk about the solutions, to talk about the methods, talk about they're much more transparent about the way that those bits of research are done, which is that, if you don't do the research, you don't know what's happening. Here's where the research is published. People can ask questions about it, having town halls, being accessible, being available, bringing people into your world much more if they want to do that. Nuclear energy has done something similar, not massively successfully, but it's done something similar. Nuclear energy was probably in the same boat as chemistry a long time ago, but now it's in terms of environmentalism, which was the massive argument against nuclear energy in the 80s and 90s. Now it's embraced by lots of people in the environmental movement as a potential savior for things like climate change. And of course, chemistry is one of those things that is really important in the fight against climate change. And if everyone cares, you have to find the thing that people are caring about. And people do care about environment and climate change and solutions to things like battery storage and all of that. And you attach your knowledge and narratives to those things. I don't think that the task should be to make chemistry and chemicals palatable to people. It's just, you are scientists doing interesting things, and here's the solutions you can provide to some of the world's biggest problems. They happen to be about chemistry, that's fine. But it shouldn't be about transforming chemistry. It should be about what can you do for the world and come in and help us to sort of solve the future. One final example I'll give you, if you look at engineers. Engineers are have a slightly different problem, which is that for most of the 20th century, they thought the word engineer in this country, at least, is not only somebody who can build a bridge across a raging torrent and send things up into space. Those are all engineers, but also somebody comes to fix your TV was an engineer. And so they had this problem of like, well, engineers, no one respected engineers. It just sound like some sort of dirty mechanic somewhere or something like that. And the task they've set themselves in the last 15, 20 years, in fact, is just solving problems. That's what engineers do. That's their entire job, is they take a real world sort of problem and they solve it. That's what they do in the real world. I'm a physics person by background, so a lot of my work was theoretical or doing computer modeling or whatever. We didn't do anything in the real world, really. It was all kind of like, imagine, what was it? If you wanted to build a perfect cow, how does a physicist do it? Imagine a spherical cow, and etc. This is that joke, isn't there? Engineers do things in the real world, and they're at the forefront of tackling this net zero problem we've got right now in terms of like reducing emissions from everything. Now, of course, chemists are also involved in this, but you need to talk about that. Engineers are not involved in thinking, they left behind a long time ago thinking that we must make engineering seem really prestigious. They just want to solve problems. And of course, in engineering, you also set up companies, you have amazing technologies that people have in their pockets. They've got so much to talk about, and it's exciting and it's positive. I think that is a narrative that one can really get hold of. I think that, if you don't do that, if you don't fill the airwaves and newspapers with this sort of stuff, then other people will fill it for you with something else.
Thank you. That's good. Thank you.
Interesting, Alok. As you said, chemistry has effectively constructed the material world around us. We used to use natural materials for clothing and bicycle wheels and all those sorts of things, and we wanted more of the stuff than there was available from the natural world, so we built a synthetic route to it. That's what happened all the way through the last 150 years of chemistry. But it's, whereas I can get excited about the Higgs boson and trying desperately to get my head around it, but understanding how my shirt works is not one of the things that I care about on a day-to-day basis. So we provide so much that people take for granted. That narrative is good. I think you're right though about the climate change thing, because in the end, carbon dioxide is a chemical, and you're going to move it between places by doing chemistry on it. So yeah, kind of fun. Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that before you get to your own question?
Yeah, I was just interested on, you mentioned careful and cohesive education campaigns, right, to get that message, that narrative over, just sort of, capture the heart and minds of the general public and bring people along with you. So in order to do that, to bring scientists to life, what forms of media do you think would be most effective for us to work alongside to kind of get our messages out there, get, where we're focusing on trying to talk about aspects that people care about?
Sarah, I flipped that question around. What sorts of media do you think you wouldn't work on? And right. Even more, what sorts of media can you afford not to engage with? And the answer, unfortunately, is all of them. You have to engage with all of them and do everything on all of them and go to people where people are. The media answer to that question is the same as the answer to the kinds of topics you want to talk about, which is you have to go to where people are, not, and then eventually if they like enough of what you're saying, then they'll come to you a little bit too. But most people have other things they want to talk about and think about, and you have to go to where they are. And that's how you earn their attention. That's how you earn their respect. It makes people who feel like they're being listened to or given something for themselves is how they begin to trust you. And then trust is the most important thing. It's not that chemists and chemicals and chemical industries are not trusted. Goodness, look, if you look at companies like Pfizer and AstraZeneca, right? Essentially chemicals companies. They might disagree, but they're essentially making vaccines and pills and things, of course, everyone is in awe of what they're doing and creating, especially in a time when they really need the thing that they're creating, right? In terms of the vaccines.
Yeah.
But you know, it's not that people don't trust chemists or anything. It's just, you know, there's communication can do a lot to show people who you are, and just showing people that you're someone trying to do some good in the world or trying to understand something in a particular way is enough for people to go, okay, fine, I'll listen, I'll do all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, but the answer to your question is all media. I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to do that all media.
Yeah, thanks for that.
That
I agree.
Lovely, beautifully set you up for your question, though, didn't it?
Well, yeah, it does actually, because we're talking more about, you know, UK chemical industry and how we can best mobilise to deliver on the UK life science vision, and what have we learned over the pandemic that can help us to deliver on that vision. And more specifically, you know, thinking about during the pandemic, scientists were front and centre in the media. That's so rarely the case. And how can we utilise the COVID blueprint where we all worked so well together as a community to tackle other areas such as cancer and dementia and climate change, and have the media sort of be part of that journey, the public be part of that journey with us as we try and tackle something else that's, you know, of key need, but so effectively as we were able to do with COVID, but we so rarely managed to do.
Okay, there's quite a few questions in there.
There's about 5.
Do you want to start with one of them, and I can sort of try and tackle them one by one?
So
what was the first one? It was, what can we learn from COVID?
What can we learn as a community, a scientific community, but as a general, the way we partner with, I guess, the general public as well. What can we learn, what we learned over COVID that we can reapply to other areas of also kind of really important needs, such as net zero, such as dementia?
Yeah, so I mean, COVID is an interesting example, isn't it? Because for scientists were in the media all the time, and at the government podium and all of those things. But you know, it's worth saying there are things we could learn, and I'll come to those in a minute. But also just be aware that this was a pretty emergency, unique situation. So let's not beat ourselves up as media or scientists about, you know, having to do everything like this again. We don't want to do everything like this. It's not, no one wants to live or work like this forever. Okay, so to answer your question though, obviously what happened with COVID was that we were in the middle of trying to understand a new virus in real time, whilst also trying to tackle it across the world, so 7 billion people. So normally, of course, when you're trying to understand something, you can just do it in your lab or a few labs for maybe a decade or more quietly, then you publish a paper, and then you can talk about it and you have command of it and you know all about it, so you can create your narratives and all that kind of stuff. So the good things were that people did listen to scientists mostly. I mean, there was a whole political angle to this as well, which perhaps there isn't time to go into now, but let's just take the good things from it. There was a lot of people listening to scientists. The people understood that we didn't know things, and so you know, this is how we find out. The thing that many scientists have said to me over the years that they've always wanted, which is that they wanted the public to understand how science works. That was front and center in this debate in COVID. And what I mean by, you know, how science works is that obviously if you do a piece of research, you find out your answers, and then someone else does something else that slightly disagrees, and then you have an argument about it, and then someone else does a third piece of work, and you carry on arguing about it, and it's just one long, often not very polite argument, isn't it? And that's what science is. But most people don't know that. They think that facts just fall out of the sky or out of labs or from pipettes and things, don't they? Right. So we discovered that in the public. Now, the problem with that is that if you're not trained as a scientist to understand that if someone else disagrees with you, it's not the end of the world and there's some other way through it, and that's how science works, it makes people think, oh my God, that initial science was just completely wrong. It was they were telling us nonsense. You know, take this thing, a drug or that drug, and it can sow distrust as well. But if you're open and transparent about it, what we see is 18 months later, people are kind of starting to get used to the idea that science changes as evidence emerges of things. It's a complicated and messy, and people misinterpret things and politicize things. But if you want science to be in the public all the time, helping people make decisions. This is the world. This is how messy the world is. And this is what you've got to accept. And you've got to accept that people will misinterpret things, but what do you do about that? You don't just decry it and disengage. What you do is you challenge, or you offer yourself to make yourself available as an expert to try and help people understand further. The answer to messiness is not to withdraw, it's to help understand and explain that messiness, and people will appreciate that and trust you more as a result. Look at all the scientists who are in the media doing Twitter or the TV or whatever else, analyzing different reports and saying what they agree with, saying what they don't agree with. That's exactly what it should be like. So public discussion should be like that. And many scientists have become quite well known for just speaking some truth about some discovery that's happened. And I think that we can learn that. We can learn that you don't have, people will take nuance as long as they trust you. But to be trusted, you have to do some work beforehand to become trusted. And that works for individuals, it works for institutions. The hard work of building up reputations and trust is done before the emergency, right? So if you want your industries to be trusted when there's an emergency, let's say there's some chemical spill in some factory somewhere, and it makes all the headlines and things, you want your organization for 5 years beforehand to be just answering chemistry questions to everybody, so that you're already there in their minds going, oh, what does these trustworthy people think? What do they think about this? If you're if it's the first time they've heard of you, then you're just another source that they're not going to be sure about what to think. We can learn that. We can learn that being open and transparent is good. We can also learn that sharing information and data and making it accessible is a good thing. This is a bit more niche, not necessarily a public thing, because the public generally don't read scientific journals, but journalists do, and they want access to them, and campaign groups do, and other intelligent people making summaries of research, they need access to journals, and we generally don't have them because they're so expensive. Now, I know that scientists have the same complaints, right? But that can't happen fast enough. That transition towards more open, checkable science from everybody. If I want to just check something out and I can't because it's behind a paywall, then I've got no information to give to my readers. It's getting better, but it rapidly moved during the early part of the pandemic. But then I think things started to go back to normal. Peer review, which used to take 6 months or 9 months or a year, took 10 days sometimes, or even 24 hours. Now, the point is, I'm not saying that everything should be like this, but that'd be good if peer review speeded up a bit and we could actually have information that was useful, available a bit more easily. I'm sure scientists would love that too. But all this nonsense for years that journals have said about, oh, it just takes us 6 months to get through your paper. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I know the caveats. I know that, everyone was focused on COVID and it's not going to be like that forever. But the structures of science are so ossified. And actually, the beginning of the pandemic broke apart a lot of those things, and I think in a good way. And I think that we can learn some of those things. I mean, I've got all sorts of other things, but those are some of the things.
No, thank you. No, I think that's great. And some of the level of collaboration between biotech, pharma, medical research councils, NHS regulators was phenomenal. And it may not ever be that way for everything, but keeping that some degree of collaboration and conversation going with that sort of scientific community that has been built, I think, over COVID-19 can maintain.
It shows what happens if you've got everyone focused on the same thing, which is not always the case, of course, with everything else. So if you think about climate change, which is a cross-sectoral issue, multi-generational issue, it will kill more people than COVID ever will over time. And it's a much bigger challenge. But it doesn't feel as pressing to people because it's literally not shutting in your house, right? So I think that there will be more discussion of what people can learn for things like climate change, for things like more complicated, knotty sort of issues. The way the technology is in society, for example, which I think that those sorts of learnings are going to come, and we're going to have more understanding of those in the coming months and years. But you're absolutely right that we should be talking about it and thinking of them and operationalizing them, because it would be an absolute waste if we just went back to normal after this.
I agree. Thanks, Alok.
So, Paul, anything to add in, and we go around the panel again, as it were?
Yes, so I have one question from the audience, which is related to what we were just talking about now. So I thought it was good to ask it. So it's talking about COVID vaccines. So it's the question is, the story of COVID vaccines illustrates the good and bad of science communication, in that we seem to have polarized society into those who deny the value of the vaccines and those that trust them. Why might this have happened? So that's what they're asking.
That came back to something you said earlier, Alok, about the MMR thing and us inheriting that narrative.
Yeah, there's a bit of that. It's very complicated, this question, because vaccine hesitancy and vaccine anti-vaccine, we need to be careful what we're talking about, because there are a group of people who think that vaccines contain microchips and trackers and will magnetize you, and that this is government control stuff. I mean, let's all agree that that's bonkers, and that's not people who are thinking straight in any way, conspiracy theorists and stuff. So what can we do about them? I don't know. I mean, what do you do about conspiracy theories? It's the whole psychology profession that needs to sort of work on that. But they're actually a very, very, very small part of the issue around vaccine hesitancy. In the early phase of the vaccine rollout, there were about 6 or 7 different types of people who were vaccine hesitant. One was people who might have had, through sort of cultural reasons or community reasons, some distrust of their healthcare systems, right? Certain populations in the US who don't trust the government around them because of historical bad deeds, they were a bit cautious. What is this stuff? Why are you giving it to? We're not sure. We need to know a bit more about it. There were people who were concerned that this thing had happened so quickly, right? If you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, one thing that was pretty consistent amongst scientists was this sort of expectation management of when vaccines might come, if ever they did, by the way. So people were saying 5 years, 6 years, maybe 10 to get it all through the system. Mm. And I know about these things, and even I was like, yeah, that sounds optimistic, but that sounds reasonable. And we did a lot of work to sort of explain that to people. This is how vaccine trials work. This is why it takes so long, blah, blah, blah. And then they came along in less than a year, and they were like, oh, here you go. Here's your vaccine that we said was going to be 10 years. Off you go, take it. Now, can you understand that if you don't understand anything about science or scientists, or have any trust, or you don't have any scientists in your life you can ask, you might think, what the hell is this stuff that they're just going to give us? There's a lot of that. And that required people to be talked to very carefully, have their questions answered. And so things moved on quickly from that. So, you can't, it goes back to my question, don't insult people, don't disrespect them. People have questions that they have, not just because they haven't had your education and your understanding of something, but it doesn't mean they're stupid. It just means that they're cautious. And then, of course, there was a whole new other group of people who just didn't have access. So when we had all these stats about the number of people who weren't being vaccinated in a particular part of the city, but it turns out because no one had driven a van to them to give them vaccines in the first place, or those people couldn't take the day off from whatever they were doing in terms of childcare or whatever else to actually go. And it was particularly populations of in ethnic minorities and lower, more disadvantaged populations that couldn't take the time to get this stuff. It wasn't because they didn't want it. So let's not bucket everyone into it as a problem of science communication. I think that there's still a problem with people who don't want it. Across Europe, there's about 20 or 30% of people in Germany, for some reason, don't want to take the vaccine. That surprises me. We need to understand why, and then craft really careful strategies to talk to those people and convince them, and address their questions and address their problems, however ridiculous you think they are. This is an important thing to do, and it's up to scientists to help craft that message. Because it matters to all of us that they do take it. Lots of people have done research into vaccine hesitancy. There's various groups. If the viewer wants to know more, if you go to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and just Google London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and the vaccine hesitancy, I think it's called the Vaccine Hesitancy Project. There's a professor there called Heidi Larson who talks about this stuff very, very intelligently and interestingly, who can tell you much more about why all this is happening and the strategies around it.
Thank you. That's good signpost, actually. I have a question related to this. Though. You've talked about thinking about your audience before, is one of the key questions that you keep asking yourself. Have you noticed a shift in the audience that science articles have had in the past 2 years? Have you noticed a change in your audience?
Well, I don't know how to answer that question because I don't know who the audience, as in, like, I've not got any data on who the audience members are that are reading all these things. What we can tell you is that loads more people, I mean, like multiples of more people are reading journalism of all types, and especially the science and health pages and things, obviously for a reason, because, you know, we've been in a pandemic, so there's been more of it, and people want to know things, explainers, very basic understanding, explanations of vaccines and trials and, you know, how antibodies work and all that sort of stuff. People want to know this stuff. It's education, essentially. So there's been a lot more people who do read that stuff. But to be honest, I'll be honest with you, everywhere I've worked, from The Guardian to ITN to The Economist, the science pages are very well read everywhere. People might not claim they're interested in science, but if you look at what they read, generally speaking, they're as well read as the politics pages. They're probably more well read in The Economist. Certainly, more people read the science pages than they do, and articles tagged science, than they read the Britain pages, for example, or the foreign pages. And that's not because those things are not important too. They're incredibly important. But it's not because necessarily people are thinking, oh, I must read the science pages. They think that's an interesting story. And ultimately, that's what it is. We pick interesting stories. And in science, we're very lucky. There are tons and tons of interesting stories. Often scientists can't see the interesting stories themselves, but there are loads of them, and people are fascinated by it, genuinely. And just as a sort of aside, some of my science colleagues have made over the years, my science correspondent colleagues, wherever I've worked, there've been maybe 2 or 3 science correspondents. And like I said, the pages are well read. And in the age of the internet, you can see what everyone's reading all the time. So it really shows up the fact that the columnists no one reads, and the newspapers, the various other science pages, people are reading loads. So, you know, that's kind of embarrassing. But anyway, what I was going to say, sorry, was that we have 2 or 3 science correspondents at all these places. Whereas if you look at the politics pages or political coverage, there's often 10, 15 reporters plus others. So they produce a lot more stuff. There's a lot more of it and stuff, but only they really are reading it. And so no one else in the world reads it. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be reading politics. It should, it's important. But makes you think we have much smaller staffs in science than we have in the other more important subjects, according to newspapers. But the readers will do whatever they want, and they read science as much, in fact, more than they do politics or things.
Brilliant, Alok. I can see the revolution coming in The Economist soon.
You look, I've been trying for years, but it's not happened, right? So I'm just, what can you say? The politics people are very important.
Oh, you have one last question.
Oh, by the way, so look, can I just add to that, since we're here, and if you don't mind me sort of ranting a little bit, which is that we science people have had the world of science to ourselves is a little bit of a secret, and we love it, and we can travel and meet all these wonderful, interesting scientists and tell all the wonderful, interesting science stories, and no one else is interested. And then suddenly COVID comes along, and now all the political journalists and the lifestyle journalists, they're all writing about science and COVID and things, and doing it with their own rules, of course, which is why you have political correspondents on the news reporting every rumor that was talked about during some phase of the pandemic as some fact, and don't understand how sometimes you can't just report rumors. You've got to check things. You've got to check numbers. You've got to check percentages, and misreading numbers. And it was a mess. I don't know what you think about this, but the politics reporters and the sort of more general news reporters covering science was an absolute disaster in the early phases of COVID. Really misinterpreting things, treating it like a gossip sport, as a science reporter, you've got to check things, and you've got to get outside comment and all these things. Standard journalism, by the way. But yeah, we're relegated to the sidelines as the political correspondents did a lot of peacocking.
Yeah. So interestingly, the last question I think Paul's going to ask you is basically along the lines of, is that being applied to climate change? So Paul.
So the question that the audience has was, how does the accusation of greenwash impact the sector?
When you're asking me
yeah.
about greenwash of the chemical industries.
Well, a greenwash of I mean, yeah, there's been a lot about various oil and gas companies claiming they're putting huge amounts of money into renewables, and people turning around and saying, well, it's 2/3 of nothing, really. Well, get real. And why are you still opening fields up? You know, I mean, is it? I mean, it was prompted. I mean, I think by your
Hey, David,
your point
I could give you my answer, but I think it has to be off the record. I mean, I think I'd like to hear from you about this, because you're in the industry, and you know about these companies, but also you are very keenly aware of the transformations necessary to get to zero emissions, have been for a long time. Do you think greenwash influences and impacts the sector?
I'm going to sort of finger Kevin first, then
Yeah,
Sarah.
I
will definitely answer it at the end.
This is a sort of the passy hot potato, isn't it? But I think you've already said it, Alok. At the end of the day, you have to go to the facts. You have to go to what is the truth here, and actually judge it. So, and I think that my slight problem with greenwash is it sort of it almost can be a label that covers a lot of different things. And I think you have to go back to, okay, what is the issue? What is, in the case of the oil companies, what are they actually doing on the ground? And actually, as part of that process, also really think about, is that proportionate, in terms of, what are they doing in terms of taking oil and printing money out of that? And are they then putting enough of it back into trying to transform their industry? But I think you have to look at the facts. What is the reality on the ground?
Yeah.
Sarah?
Yeah, I was just thinking it's a potentially a narrative thing for the industry, right? So, the industry has been for a long time thinking where we can use green reagents wherever possible. We can be more efficient in our sort of synthetic processes to reduce waste output wherever possible. And that's been front and center for a while now, I think, across the industry, but maybe our narrative there isn't strong across maybe the broader media network. So we don't have a strong voice there in the community to get that message over.
And I think it comes back to, if you look across huge swathes of renewable energy, they have issues around the materials they use, whether that's battery, lithium and cobalt, and so I think it's also a sort of trying to be real about where we are in that journey from an industry that climate change just wasn't registered to an endpoint where actually climate change is being appropriately addressed in a sustainable way. And that's not just in terms of CO2, but it's in terms of all the other materials that are going into that, and land, frankly, which is how do you get to that energy dimension, which is sustainable. And I think and so for me, that's the key bit about that greenwashing label, which is really, you've got to get past that to really understand what that journey looks like.
Yeah,
that's my view.
And I'm very much with particularly Kevin, because it's about the data. And if you look at the data, there are many companies out there that are making enormous strides to look after the health of their workers and the health of the environment, and they're doing some really amazing things. And there are people who are cynically abusing the reporting thing. That's what, it's kind of everywhere. But it's go look at the reports and see where the money's going, because that will tell you what they're really interested in, and that's, I think, the important thing. And one of the great things about the SCI is we work with a number of companies who are really, really serious about this and taking responsibility for changing the world while not taking away things, because we are all complicit in whether we're driving internal combustion engine cars or whatever. We've been doing it for 100 years. We've all been taking the fruits of it, and we have to change. And there's a weird dialogue that's necessary between consumers and governments and companies about how fast we have to change. we have to sadly draw it to an end. I could go on forever. And if we were in the real world, I would take you around the star at the back, Alok, and keep you drinking. I think this has been magic. I mean, the one, I mean, there are a few key phrases I took from Alok's talk and such. And the first one was, you have to win interest. I thought that was a really important point. I mean, you can't assume that people have the link between what we might say about the chemicals or chemistry using industries and their daily life. We have to convince them. I thought that was really good. And the other thing, which I think both Kevin and Sarah picked up in your stories, is you have to engage people over time and build trust. I think that's really important. I was long ago sold on tell a story. I work with some great communications people, as you know, many of them, of course, because that's how we met in the first place. And you know, stories are addictive. You want to know how it ends. And you know, I thought it was interesting. You know, what is it? There are 7 story archetypes, of which the hero's joy is one. But the most important one was your point about the difference between intelligence and specific knowledge. Yeah, we talk to people who know an awful lot about what they know about, and it's our job to try and get them to understand where we're coming from in all these issues. So, I mean, I really think that it's been a great afternoon. I think we could have done 2 hours. It's been just so much enjoyable. And yeah, I will at some point when we can take you out for a beer and pick your brains some more, Alec, because I always get fascinated by these conversations. Thank you very much. Thank you particularly to Kevin and Sarah for thinking up questions that are kind of core to where we are in the chemistry using industries, and Paul's enormous help, and of course Theo and Richard in the background, in case, making sure that it all works much more smoothly than I deserve it to. So I mean, I just want to, if I can just go back and share my screen for one last time. I mean, it's a word from our sponsors, effectively. The SCI is an organization which has been around for 140 years now, trying to make the link between sciences, particularly chemistry, but other sciences, applied for the benefit of society. We do lots and lots of things. I won't read them all out because you can read them. But I mean, if you're at all interested in the sort of debate we've had today, please talk to us at the SCI. This is core of what we're doing. The last SCI talk was by Roger Highfield. It's about the same sort of subject. It's about how we actually communicate what we do. Really, thank you very much, but particularly to Alok, because when I asked him to do this, he was kind of, I don't do that sort of thing. I think he's got a new career coming up now of explaining science to chemists and scientists, and read his books, and they're all on Amazon, aren't they, Alok? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So, I mean, thank you very much, everybody. And if you want to know anything more, please do contact us. And there's other things. Yeah, please contact us about anything. And thank you very much for your time this evening. It's been a buzz. Thank you, guys.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.